Valentin knew he would die tonight. Not for the first time in his 422 years' existence, but perhaps for the last. The poison coursing through his veins was no ordinary affliction, not something a vampire could simply sleep off or feed away. It was a venom crafted specifically for his kind, and only one person in the entire city was capable of producing it: Marcus, his own war counselor. Marcus, the man Valentin had saved from a massacre 2 centuries ago. Marcus, who now sought to seize his throne as Valentin felt his body failing, his reflexes dulling, his legendary strength dissolving like smoke. He had fled the subterranean palace where he had reigned for 4 centuries, from the stone chamber where his throne still awaited a king who would never return. He needed to disappear, needed to think, needed to breathe, though breath hadn't sustained him in ages. The bar was called Almeida's, a late-night joint in a forgotten corner of the city where working girls, dealers, and the truly desperate came to drown their lives. Perfect. No one looked too closely at anyone in here. Valentin slipped in around 2 a.m. when the crowd was thick enough to swallow him whole. He settled into a dark booth, his crimson eyes burning in the dim light, watching everything and nothing all at once. The poison in his veins caused pain, a sensation he'd forgotten existed. Vampires didn't feel pain the way humans did. Wounds healed in seconds. But this was different. This was death creeping in, slowly burning every cell from the inside out. He'd survived wars, betrayals, fires, even a vampire hunter's assault years ago. But tonight, surrounded by people paying to drink, to dance, to forget, Valentin finally understood the true meaning of despair. His vision began to blur. Time was running out. That's when he saw her. Mara moved through the bar carrying a tray of drinks, her movements precise despite the surrounding chaos. She had something rare: presence. Even among dozens of shouting, laughing patrons, Mara moved with a quiet grace, as if the entire world spun around her in slow motion. Valentin noticed her eyes first, eyes that held a deep weariness, the kind of fatigue that only comes from never-ending responsibility. Her dark hair was pulled back into a messy bun, and there were faint shadows under her eyes. She was somewhere between 30 and 35, a beauty not celebrated in places like this, a beauty ignored because it was too common.
Too real, too tired to be considered valuable. But it was what she carried in her arms that made Valentin move for the first time that night, despite the pain sweeping through his body like a storm. It was a baby. Mara carried a child in one arm, balancing the tray of drinks in the other hand. The baby was small, perhaps 2 or 3 years old, and utterly silent. That in itself wasn't strange. Children fell asleep all the time. But it was the way the baby didn't stir, didn't shift its position, didn't visibly breathe that caught Valentin's attention. It was the way its eyes were open, pale almost to the point of being white, and utterly devoid of any childlike expression. It was the way the baby observed the entire room without blinking, without flinching at the noise, as if it couldn't hear it at all. Valentin felt his dead heart kick into a beat, then another. He knew that kind of pallor. He knew those empty eyes. He'd seen them in mirrors for centuries. The baby was a vampire, and it was being carried by a human woman who clearly had no idea what she held in her arms. Valentin crossed the bar in 5 strides, his hand already reaching for the dagger he kept beneath his coat. There were rules in vampire society, ancient rules written in blood over 2 millennia ago. Vampire children were property of the kingdom, trained from birth, integrated into the hierarchy. A vampire child raised by an unwitting human was an abomination. It was a threat, a biological time bomb that needed to be disarmed before it detonated. But when Mara sensed his approach and her eyes met Valentin's, when he saw the way she immediately shielded the baby behind her, protecting the child with her own body, something inside Valentin that had been frozen for centuries began to thaw. She didn't know what he was, didn't know she was looking at a killer who had wiped out entire generations. She only knew her child needed her, and she had offered her own life in exchange for the child's. In that instant, with the poison burning his veins, with death closing in, with his own kingdom collapsing, Valentin faced a choice no vampire had ever confronted. He could eliminate the baby right then, uphold vampire law, preserve his position. Or he could do something he hadn't done in 432 years. He could choose. And that black woman carrying a silent child in her arms in a noisy bar was about to force him to make choices that would rewrite everything he was.
Mara took 3 steps back, her body forming a living shield between Valentin and her child. The baby didn't react to the movement, didn't stir, didn't cry out for help in any sound. It merely continued to observe the stranger with those pale, empty eyes, as if recognizing something in his face that its muted body couldn't express. Valentin saw the fear in Mara, saw the raw courage of a mother willing to face anything. He also saw her absolute lack of understanding about who her child truly was. He could have told her the truth right then, could have revealed everything, that the child was a vampire, that it was an abomination by law, that both of them were alive only because he still drew breath. But when his eyes met hers again, Valentin did something that surprised him as much as it did her. He took a deep breath, drew his hand away from the dagger, and bowed like a servant before a queen. "My name is Valentin," he said, his voice intentionally weak, almost broken. It was true. It was also a monumental risk. "May I sit, just for a moment? I promise I won't harm you or your child." Mara hesitated. Every instinct that had kept her alive as a single mother in that city screamed at her to run, call for security, do anything but trust this man. But there was something in his eyes that disarmed her. There was suffering there. There was urgency. There was, strangely, humanity. She slowly lowered the tray of drinks onto a nearby table, making sure her body remained between Valentin and the baby, but nodded for him to sit. Valentin sank into the chair as if he'd run a marathon. The poison was worsening. His fingers trembled slightly, and he hid them under the table. She noticed anyway. "You're sick," Mara said. It wasn't a question. Something in her work as a waitress had trained her to read people. She knew when someone was ill, scared, in danger. "You need a doctor." Valentin laughed, a sound that came out as a cough. "There's no doctor for what I have." He observed the baby for a long moment, his crimson eyes studying every detail of the small creature. The baby returned his gaze. There was recognition there, some kind of instinctive call between 2 creatures of the night. "Your child," Valentin began, choosing each word carefully, "isn't entirely human, is he?" Mara stiffened. Her hand instinctively shielded the baby. "How do you know that?" Valentin sighed, and in that moment, under the bar's yellowed light, his body dissolving from within. Everything she knew about her life, about her child, was falling apart. The baby remained silent, always silent, as if it already knew that silence was the only way to survive in this world it was discovering. Valentine finally stopped in a subterranean chamber, a room that had once been a palace long ago, now just ruins covered in moss and forgotten memories. He leaned against the wall, and Mara clearly saw for the first time what he was. His crimson eyes glowed like dying embers. His skin, which had only seemed pale in the bar, was now almost translucent, and she could see black veins pulsing beneath the surface. "Your child," Valentine began, his voice now so weak Mara had to lean closer to hear, "was conceived 3 years ago. His father was a vampire named Cristovum. He was my general, my right hand, powerful, charismatic, dangerous." Mara felt the ground disappear beneath her feet. She had known Cristovum, had slept with him after weeks of seduction at a bar he frequented. He had vanished overnight, leaving her pregnant and alone. "He didn't know you were pregnant," Valentine continued. "I did. My people did. And I made a choice that condemned you to a life of secrets and condemned my own kingdom." Mara sat on the stone floor, holding her child closer. "Why? Why didn't you kill me? Why didn't you kill my son?" Valentine looked at the baby, that small, silent vampire who was the product of a liaison that should have remained only within vampire records. "Because Cristovum was killed by Marcus 2 years ago, a political conspiracy. And because," Valentine paused, as if gathering strength to utter the next words, "when I discovered you were alive and the baby had been born, I realized the universe was offering a second chance for something I had lost long ago." In that moment, the earth trembled. It wasn't a natural tremor. It was the sound of vampires scouring the tunnels, their search growing desperate and violent. Marcus had alerted all of vampire society. He had put a bounty on Valentine's head. Any vampire who brought him in, dead or alive, would be elevated in the hierarchy. Mara stood, her body responding to the danger with pure adrenaline. "We need to get out of here," she said, and there was a strength in her voice Valentine hadn't heard before. The mother had taken the place of the frightened woman. "Where can we go?" Valentine took a deep breath, and the pain of it made him double over. The poison was spreading faster now. He had perhaps a few hours left, if that. "There's a place, Milbrother, Theodor. He lives outside the hierarchy, outside the politics. He knows how to neutralize vampire venom, or at least how to prolong my life long enough for us to strike a deal with Marcos. But to reach him, you'll need to know the full truth about who you carry in your arms." Mara looked at her son, that child she had raised alone, that child who had never cried, never screamed, never asked for help in any way a human could recognize. "He's more than just an ordinary vampire," Valentine continued. "His muteness isn't a disability, it's a rare genetic trait. Mute vampires were considered sacred 1,000 years ago, before the modern hierarchy eliminated them. They possess abilities normal vampires don't. Telepathy, a connection to the species' collective mind. Your son is practically an oracle, Mara. And if Marcus discovers this, he won't try to kill him. He'll try to enslave him. He'll try to use your son's mind to control all of vampire society." The vampire's footsteps grew louder, closer. Valentine took Mara's hand with his cold, trembling fingers. "Do you still want to trust me?" Mara looked at her son, then at the man who was dying to protect them, then at the darkness that approached with every heartbeat she felt in her chest. "Yes," she replied, "but you have to promise me one thing, Valentine.
Do you promise my son will never be enslaved by anyone? Do you promise he'll have a choice?" Valentin smiled, and in that smile were centuries of redemption. "I promise, Mara, and to make that promise mean something, I'll need to change everything I am." Theodore's house was a quiet, sprawling estate far from the city lights, an old manor that had once belonged to aristocrats before becoming a refuge for exiled vampires. Valentin had managed to get there, but only thanks to Mara. She had hot-wired a car in a parking lot, had driven while Valentin convulsed in the back seat, the poison burning his veins. She had kept the baby calm throughout the journey, even when the poison started making Valentin vomit black blood in the back seat. Even when the other vampires almost caught them on the highway. Even when the police pulled them over and she had to pretend she was his wife taking her sick husband to a hospital. She had done all this for a man she had known only a few hours, for a child she didn't fully understand was her responsibility to protect. When they finally arrived at Theodore's house, Mara had understood there was no turning back. She had crossed a line that separated the human world from the vampire world, and now resided somewhere between the two, belonging to neither and hostage to both. Theodore was ancient, not in appearance but in essence. He looked like a man in his 60s, but his eyes held the wisdom of someone who had existed for over 2 millennia. He had been the first vampire Valentine had created 500 years ago, and had chosen to withdraw when the hierarchy began to grow corrupt. When he saw his creator being carried into his home by a black woman and a silent baby, Theodore asked no questions. He simply began to work. Theodore possessed knowledge of ancient vampire alchemy, of practices the modern hierarchy had forbidden. He prepared an elixir that slowed Marcus's poison, giving Valentine days of life instead of hours. As he worked, applying cool compresses to Valentine's forehead and whispering words in dead languages, Theodore spoke with Mara. "Do you know what you've done?" he asked, grinding herbs in a stone mortar. "You've irrevocably broken vampire law, a law that has stood for 3 millennia. You protected a vampire child. You aided a king in exile. You've involved yourself in politics in a way no human ever should." Mara, sitting on the floor with her son finally asleep in her arms, responded with the honesty of someone who had nothing left to lose. "I did what a mother does. I protected my child. If that breaks vampire laws, then vampire laws are wrong." Theodore chuckled, a sound like wind through ancient ruins. "Valentine chose well. You have the courage he lost centuries ago." On the morning of the 3rd day, Marcus arrived at the house. He didn't come alone. He came with 50 vampires, with the authority of a majority who had voted in his favor while Valentine was away. He came with documents declaring Valentine dethroned, with proclamations transferring all power to his person. And he came with an offer even Theodore hadn't foreseen. Marcus entered the room where Valentine rested, where Mara slept beside him, where the baby silently observed with those pale, empty eyes. "I've come to make an offer to the king who is no longer king," Marcus said, his voice soft as venom. "You can die here, surrounded by humans and exiles, or you can serve me. You can be my counselor, my vizier, my vassal. Your life will be preserved. The woman's life will be preserved."
Even the life of this aberration will be preserved, but under my control. Marcus paused dramatically. All you have to do is hand over the baby. Let me study him. Let me discover how to harness his powers to usher in a new era of vampire might. Valentin rose from the bed, still weak, still dying, but on his feet. Theodore had bought him time, but only time. The poison would continue to corrode his existence. He had perhaps 3 days, 4 at most. And in that moment, when everything he had built had vanished, when his only choice was submission or death, Valentine looked at Mara. She was awake now, her son in her arms, her eyes filled with a determination that rivaled any vampire's. "If you take my son," she said to Marcus, her voice trembling but unshakable, "you'll have to take me too. And he won't cooperate with you, because I will teach him every day of his life that he is free, that he is loved, and that no king, no law, no hierarchy can take that from him." Marcus smiled. "Then you both die." He raised his hand, and 50 vampires prepared to attack. In that moment, when death was about to descend upon them like a storm, when all seemed lost, the baby finally did something no one had ever witnessed before. It opened its mouth, not to scream, not to cry, but to transmit something through a telepathic connection that swept through the entire room like a shock wave. 50 vampires crumpled to the floor, their bodies convulsing, their hearts racing beyond what they could bear. And Valentine in that instant understood that Mara's son wasn't just an oracle. He was a weapon that had just chosen its side. Marcus looked at the baby with an expression that blended fear and greed. "Imagine," he whispered, "what you could accomplish if you were under my command." Valentine took a deep breath, felt death burning in his veins, and knew he had only one choice left, a choice that would define everything. Valentine stepped forward, his eyes meeting Marcus's. The poison burned his veins like lava, his death certain now, accelerated by the baby's telepathic transmission that had consumed what little energy he had left. But for the first time in 432 years, Valentine felt truly alive. "You want a weapon?" he asked Marcus, his voice now strong despite his weakening body. "I'll give you something better. I'll give you the truth." Valentine raised his hand, and as he did, he noticed his fingers glowed faintly, as if his very vampiric blood was transforming into light. Marcus's poison, mingling with his ancient essence, had created something unexpected. It had forged a bridge between death and life, between power and redemption. "The truth is, you've always been weak, Marcus. You've always needed power borrowed from others, first from me, now from this child. But true power," Valentine looked at Mara, looked at the baby, looked at Theodore who remained in the shadows. "True power doesn't come from domination. It comes from choice, from free will, from loving something more than you love yourself." Marcus's hands trembled. He had waited 400 years for this moment, had planned every detail of his conspiracy, had slowly poisoned his king for years. And now, when he finally held absolute power in his hands, he discovered that power was merely an illusion, a cage he had built for himself. The 50 vampires around him felt the shift, felt that moment when the balance tipped, not because Valentine was stronger, but because Valentine had ceased to be a king and had become something far more powerful, a chosen one. Valentine lunged at Marcus, not as a warrior, not as a king, but as a man who had found something worth dying for. They collided in an explosion of ancient vampiric energy, a clash between the power that had reigned for centuries and the corrupt power that had sought to usurp it. When the dust settled, only one of them remained standing. Marcus lay on the ground, his eyes still open, still covetous, still empty of any truth Valentin had tried to impart. The king was dead, the conspirator too, and Valentin, wounded, bleeding, dying, walked back to Mara with a smile on his lips. "Is it over?" she asked, holding her son against her chest. Valentin took a deep breath, and with that breath felt the final hours of his life drawing in. The poison had consumed everything. He had used his last energies to defeat Marcus, to protect Mara, to save a child who wasn't even entirely his own. "It's over," he replied, "and it's just beginning." In that moment, as his crimson eyes flickered and dimmed, Valentin did something no vampire had done in thousands of years. He willingly accepted death. He didn't fight it, he embraced it. And as he descended into the final darkness, he whispered ancient words in a language Mara didn't understand, but which her son comprehended perfectly through the telepathy vampires shared. Valentin's body vanished into golden ashes. Not as undead vampire normally disappeared, in corruption and darkness, but in light, in redemption, in transformation. Theodore, who had witnessed such things for 2,000 years, finally understood. Valentin hadn't died, he had ascended. He had become something new, something the vampire hierarchy had never seen, a true legend. Mara stayed at the secluded estate with Theodore and her son. The vampires who had come with Marcus scattered, some accepting the new regime, others simply fading into the night. The news of Valentin's death, of Marcus's downfall, of the existence of a sacred vampire child, swept through vampire society like an earthquake. Mara was no longer an ignored waitress. Now she was the mother of the future. Now she was the woman who had taught a king that true power was choosing to love. Her son was no longer silent out of weakness. He was silent because he had been born with a wisdom that transcended language. He was the bridge between two worlds. But on the night Mara finally managed to rest, when Theodore slept and her son watched the moon through the window, something unexpected happened. The house began to glow. A golden light emanated from the floor, from the air, from every shadow. And when